Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com. Mark Twain said, "There's something fascinating about science. One gets such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact." Michael Mann must be the world's smartest person because he observes things about the climate which nobody else sees. Around the year 1998, Michael Mann determined that the Earth had been cooling for 900 years, and then suddenly around the year 1910, the Earth started heating up out of control due to the burning of fossil fuels. Other academics have extended his work and determined that the past century was the warmest in more than 20,000 years by a wide margin. Now I'm going to show you how talented Michael Mann is. He sees things which nobody else can see. Michael Mann saw that the world was heating out of control, but Keith Breffa, working around the same time, didn't see any warming at all during the 20th century. There was some warming during the first 40 years of the 20th century, but this was followed by a large amount of rapid cooling. In the 1995 report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they didn't see any troposphere warming from 1958 through the middle of the 1990s. In the 1990 United Nations report, they didn't see any anomalous warming during the 20th century. In 1989, the head of climate analysis at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration didn't see any anomalous warming either. Tom Carl said most of the warming occurred before the year 1919 and that Earth actually cooled from 1921 to 1979. This is the exact opposite of what Michael Mann's hockey stick graph showed. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research showed that Earth was cooler in 1970 than it was in 1870. Their graph was similar to the reconstruction of Keith Breffa around 1998. In 1975, Science News wasn't worried about global warming. They were worried about a new ice age which was going to bury Manhattan in ice. In 1972, 42 top American and European investigators sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. NASA warned of a new ice age as early as the year 2021. The National Academy of Sciences graph was very similar to that of Breffa and the National Center for Atmospheric Research. The press was very worried about a new ice age occurring. Time magazine wrote, "Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warmth-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. Since the 1940s, the mean global temperature has dropped about 2.7 degrees." New York Times, July 18, 1970. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. In 1977, the Central Intelligence Agency was worried that global cooling was going to disrupt human civilization. New York Times, January 5, 1978. International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere. Los Angeles Times, Christmas Eve, 1962. End of world feared with another ice age. Science must find a way to avert big freeze to save Earth's rapidly growing population. Scientists were worried about a new ice age, but according to Michael Mann, Earth had been heating up out of control for 60 years. Now let's look at the bottom of the hockey stick when temperatures were supposed to be the coldest of the last 1,000 years. Glaciers were melting so rapidly in Montana that experts predicted all of the ice would be gone before the year 1950. Glaciers in Glacier National Park melted very rapidly from 1850 to 1950, but then the melting slowed way down. And over the last 30 years, glaciers in Glacier National Park have actually been growing. The glaciers in Glacier National Park are no older than 6,500 years, and they reached their peak around the year 1850, after which time they started melting very rapidly. But according to the hockey stick, temperatures are much warmer now than they were 6,000 years ago. So according to the hockey stick, there were no glaciers when it was cold, but now that temperatures are much warmer, the glaciers are growing. In 1922, in the Monthly Weather Review, it was reported that the Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas around Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. Formerly, the waters about Spitsbergen held an even summer temperature of about 3 degrees Celsius. This year recorded temperatures up to 15 degrees, and last winter the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. There was no ice around Spitsbergen 100 years ago, but this year there's lots of ice around Spitsbergen. So if we believe Michael Mann's hockey stick, we have to believe that ice melts when it's cold and ice forms when it's much warmer. Like the glaciers in Montana, Greenland's largest glacier retreated very rapidly from 1850 to 1950, and then the melting slowed down. And now that glacier has stopped melting and actually started growing. The behavior of the ice in Greenland makes no sense in the context of Michael Mann's hockey stick graph. He shows that Earth was cooling from 1850 to 1910 and was the coldest years of the last 1,000. And of course the press fully supports his scam. They claim that the glaciers which are growing in Greenland are actually melting 100 times faster than previously thought. Now let's go to the very bottom of the hockey stick around the year 1912. November 30th, 1912, shrinking glaciers. It appears that except over a small area, the glaciers of the world are retreating to the mountains. Glaciers were melting in the Rocky Mountains, in South America, in Greenland, Scandinavia, and the Alps. So if we believe Michael Mann's hockey stick, we also have to believe that glaciers melt when it's cold and they grow when the air is much warmer. This week in 1912, Paris, France reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And Seattle, Washington also reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit this week in 1912. If we had weather that hot now in mid-May, academics would claim 99% certainty that it was caused by the burning of fossil fuels. Let's look at the New York Times article again from May 13th, 1912. Hottest of Mays in Paris. Paris, May 12th. The year 1912, already remarkable as opening with the driest spring Paris has experienced for 2.5 centuries, adds another record to its credit, last week being the hottest ever recorded in May. The thermometer wavered between 86 and 90 degrees in the shade. The Meteorological Bureau declares that such readings have never been made before the middle of June at the earliest. Parisians are suffering greatly from the unexpected heat and the penetrating dust. Practically no rain having fallen in 8 weeks, and there are fears of a repetition of last year's disastrous drought. So let's take a look at what the weather was like in the prior year. In April 1912, the Titanic sank after colliding with a giant iceberg that calved off of a glacier. The mainstream media now blames glacial calving on global warming. There was a huge amount of glaciers in the North Atlantic that year, which according to Michael Mann was one of the coldest on record. 1 year earlier, 1911, was a truly remarkable year. In early February 1911, there was an unprecedented heat wave in Texas. Dallas reached 93 degrees in the shade on February 2nd. Then in May 1911, there was another unprecedented heat wave. Temperatures in New England got over 100 degrees. People were dying from the heat in the United States in 1911, well before Memorial Day. During the summer of 1911, more than 40,000 people died from the heat in Paris. The heat wave lasted for 70 days from July to September and killed more than 1,000 people in Germany as well. The worst heat wave on record in New England occurred during July 1911 and killed thousands of people. The Boston Globe reported temperatures of 112 degrees in Maine and 110 degrees in New Hampshire. Temperatures like that are completely incomprehensible now. The sweltering heat drove people to suicide. So glaciers were melting all over the world and it was very hot, but according to Michael Mann and his friends, those were the coldest years of the last 10,000. Now let's go back further in time to what the United Nations described in 1990 as the Holocene maximum. According to the United Nations in 1990, Earth was much warmer around 5,000 years ago than it is now. But Michael Mann and his friends have completely erased the Holocene warm period. It no longer exists in their graph. Unfortunately, though, for Michael Mann and his friends, the historical record shows that what they're saying simply isn't true. 5,000 years ago, trees grew all the way to the edge of the Arctic Ocean in Canada. The tree line now is 80 to 100 kilometers further south. During the Holocene maximum, the Arctic Ocean may have been periodically ice-free. But there's lots of ice in the Arctic now, which according to Michael Mann and his friends is much warmer than it was 5,000 years ago. Nothing about Michael Mann's hockey stick makes any sense when compared against the historical record. Michael Mann is a total fraud, but it has been reported he's become very wealthy doing the bidding of Washington politicians who want to shut down fossil fuels. The attacks on Michael Mann's critics have become very familiar. Steve McIntyre has done more to expose Michael Mann's fraud than anyone, so the people behind the climate scam accuse him of being a Russian agent. There seems to be no limit to how low climate scamsters are willing to go. Michael Mann refuses to debate anyone who criticizes his work and uses the excuse that anyone who disagrees with him is a fossil fuel industry stooge for profit and they threaten our children's future. Anyone who questions Michael Mann's work, like Judith Curry, gets run out of academia. The corrupt state of climate science and academia is quite an embarrassment, and Toto's been barking about it for the past 15 years. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki, Upla, and the 4 new puppies on the web at realclimatescience.com.